I appreciate, there we go, I got it. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thanks, George. Thanks, Phil. I really appreciate the invitation and happy to be here with Andy. It's fun to prognosticate, I guess. So we'll see how much fun it is today. When we were talking about this, we made a long list of things we could talk about. If you were kind of got on early, you heard I have an hour's worth of material for my 2 minutes here. And, we could go on for hours and hours. But we did kind of agree on an agenda, and I'm going to touch on some things that really aren't on it. And surprisingly, I'll just say as an agenda item, COVID-19 is not really on it, although, that pretty much pervades everything we do these days. For me personally, it's a real mixed bag. I'm lucky enough to have a nice little home office, but the divided pane windows start to look like jail bars after a while. So it's a mixed bag. Working from home, it's funny. I meant to talk about DEP staff and managers. How are they doing? Where are they doing? What are we seeing? I know I'm seeing a lot of delays, really in everything across the board. It's a little bit hit or miss. There are some staff and managers who you can, get in contact with. They get back to you. You can schedule meetings, things get done. And there are other situations where that's just not the case. And we're seeing a lot of delays. And I think, some of it's attributable to COVID-19 pandemic, work from home. And I think we're going to continue to see that, permits, scheduling meetings, return phone calls or not. Other things, maybe some more granular items I wanted to mention that affects site remediation directly that we're going to see in 2022. Obviously, we have the May 2022 deadline. Many of us are dealing with requests for extension right now. We're going to be dealing with disagreements over, is your RI complete? Is your RA complete? Maybe that'll follow May 2022 a bit, but I'm seeing that in my cases now. Calls for direct oversight, continue to be prevalent in my work. So I think we're going to see more of that in 2022. But what else? PFAS, I think it's only going to get worse. Catching up on vapor intrusion and eco investigations, risk assessment. I'm seeing in some of my cases, old cases, new cases where, was the RI complete? Well, was all the vapor intrusion work done? Was all the eco work done? That sort of lagging work that, now we need to catch up on. And of course, we have new remediation standards, ethyl benzene. That's going to drive more work for us as well in 2022, I think. So, there's my 2-minute race. I guess who's up next? Phil?
I'm up next. So yeah, and I did forget to mention again, this program is brought by Continuing Professional Education Services. George did refer to me as his partner. We're partners there. Now, George and I have worked together for.
I'm signing off, Phil.
Yeah, that's only one. That's one drop there. I am a member of the licensing board. George has recently stepped down. But really, what I wanted to take up my 2 minutes on is I still go back and I talk about this all the time in every class that I teach. 2009 created our profession as an LSRP. Okay, it's something for years and years and years. Professional geologists were working on something. There was something, a profession, and I believe, and we're gonna talk a little about the beating up of the profession over the past 12 years as it's been, or longer. And I think that the battle or debates between the DEP and the LSRP is only getting worse. And I go back to the fact, and we'll see how well I did in a recent response to a notice of technical deficiency. The LSRP has an ability to use their independent professional judgment. And I think that works if we as LSRPs document and defend our independent professional judgment. If we put something forth and we have certified it and we believe in it and we document it in the documents that we submit to the department, and I will tell you, don't think that you're writing too much. Put your lines of evidence, put everything out there, and don't be so quick of withdrawing documents. You know, if you have put something out there, stand behind it. This is my personal opinion. It is what I do in my practice, and it's a battle. And you know, in my case, I do a lot of contract work, so it's a battle I don't get paid for. But at the end, that's the difficult part of where we are. DP doesn't care if you're not getting paid. DP doesn't care if they send back an NTD that's not part of a contract. So I will tell you, and I'm going to end my 2 minutes right there, that is something as an LSRP, we need to make sure that every day we work to defend our profession because we worked long enough to get there. Now I'll turn it over to Mr. Robbins.
So when the first concepts were being discussed in the stakeholder sessions before Site Remediation Reform Act, there was a recognition that it would be a change in how the department and consultants operated with each other. It was described as a sea change, and there was a lot of discussion about how strict the guideposts need to be in department's conduct and LSRP's conduct, and it was left somewhat loose. And as Senator Smith and I think Irene Kropp, who both worked very hard on that legislation, came with that there has to be a development of trust between the department and LSRPs. And there are a lot of aspects of the program that still work, and the LSRP program is still better than what was there beforehand. But I think it's fair to say that what we've seen gradually and maybe increasing recently is a lot of signs that that trust really never fully developed. And it comes out in lots of instances, some of which everyone has just mentioned, and we'll go into a couple of those for the rest of the program. But for me, it really comes down to a focus from a regulatory agency perspective way too often on form over substance, or I really should say forms over science and professional judgment. And that's what we're facing here. It's in many instances irrelevant to the protection of public health and safety, but the issues get grinded out between the parties. It's issues like, I'll use an example that has come up amazingly too often, an LSRP doing a bi-certification for a cap site where it's pavement and there's a crack in the pavement, and their fights, it's impact to its direct contact is the issue. So there's pavement, there's subbase beneath it, there's contamination somewhere below that, and the cap can be cracked and people are not exposed to the soils below. There's a huge pothole, that's a different issue. And there have been hours spent whether or not that crack needs to be sealed and how it needs to be sealed, or whether or not the patch that was done, which was done for convenience as a asphalt patch in a concrete sidewalk, violated the remedial action permit. In my mind, it's absurdity. When we were talking about the Site Remediation Reform Act in the stakeholder sessions, I made the statement, didn't make a lot of people happy, that some of what the department was making its staff do made the staff look stupid. Like, here are 8 diagrams, all oriented in the same way. 7 of them have a north arrow on them. The 8th is a blow up of one of the sections. It didn't have it, a deficiency letter goes out. And you talk to people, I mean, that's just absurdity at that level. And we still have that going on. And in some cases, it's been increasing together with, and it still happens, it's supposedly happening less, threats that the department will go to the board and file a complaint against the LSRP, which is inappropriate. So that's.
Okay, so Andy's opening statement. So thanks, guys. So we're going to go on to our first topic is how DEP attrition affects remediation. Andy and Steve are going to tackle this, but I will say last week at the board meeting, I made a comment that the department was now clueless. And that was because Ken and Karen Clue retired. That was what my comment was about, but I'll turn it over to you guys on how that affects remediation. You have to unmute yourself, Steve.
Steve's still muted. There you go.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think it's fair to say, I don't want to speak for the others, but we did prepare for this, and I think we're all concerned about DEP attrition. A heck of a lot of institutional knowledge and experience and expertise, walking out the door. And, how does that get backfilled? Can it? Should it? But, many, I look on the screen, many senior practitioners here. We've been doing this for a long time. You go into a meeting with DEP, a technical consultation at this point. Maybe you've got a groundwater issue, and the top person, I won't mention her name, says this is the answer. And I don't know how many cases I've had where that was the precise situation. It depended on that person to say this is the answer. And good thing she was there. Well, what about when she's not? And I'm not suggesting anything about Mary Ann, because I haven't heard anything about Mary Ann. But backfilling these key positions, decision makers, scientists, is I think an urgent issue for the agency, and something that we're all concerned about. So, Andy, you want to jump in?
I think there's attrition. There's a lot of new staff in there. Some of the new staff is learning quickly. Some of it isn't. It's a lot of middle management has also left. It makes it harder. But there is a perception, and I've seen enough incidents to raise it as a concern, that the staff is not being directed to recognize the professional judgment of LSRPs. That the staff is not willing to accept that the professional judgment of someone who in many of those instances are far more experienced, or at the minimum say, I understand your position, let me talk to my supervisor so that I can understand whether or not we have an issue with that. The staff seems very ready to be able to call out an issue, because if it doesn't fit neatly into a specific box, it must not be right. And you need to have a deeper understanding of what's going on. And because of the work from home issues and a number of other aspects in attrition, it's getting harder to get that second call or third call in to someone to say, how does this make sense? I've had at least 3 cases where ancient cases have been brought up on deficiencies because there wasn't a complete RI, even though there was an RAW approved by the field office. And that, trying to find the document, and eventually we found it, that the RI was improved with the RAW, and it was part of the same document, but the title of the approval letter didn't list RI. You shouldn't have to hire an attorney to figure that out. And that's happening all the time. And it's not protective of human health and the environment as the focus, it's protective of how it fits into their instructions. Steve, I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I don't do this that often. That's quote somebody, but a couple of things that you said made me think of it. I think it was Winston Churchill said, what is it? Perfection is the enemy of progress and of the good. And I think, some of what we're seeing, sort of like these nitpicky comments, small comments, the kinds of things that you identified before as a technical deficiency, the sort of perfect being the enemy of the good, check the box wrong on the form, and that means your submission gets kicked out without maybe a close look. Again, sort of the perfect being the enemy of the good and progress. And when we think about has the LSRP program achieved the goals that were kind of laid out at the beginning? Well, I'm really not so sure. Facilitating cleanup and redevelopment of brownfields, I always thought that was it. We're still doing it, but we've kind of just changed the program. So to bring it back to kind of personnel, I think maybe it is that staff, or the younger staff, or less experienced staff are looking at some of these details that are easily kind of considered and addressed, rather than the big picture. And when I sort of step back, somebody, I think it was George or Andy or both of you mentioned, professional judgment and LSRPs exercising professional judgment, and is it being deferred to properly under the statute? And is perfection being the enemy of the good and the progress that we need here for the program? Well, I think there are questions about all of that. And
then the other issue is
DEP attrition doesn't help.
And we've seen some attrition in the number of LSRPs. The first group of LSRPs have decided that they've aged out. I don't think they have, but they've decided they have. More power to them, I guess.
You're just jealous.
And you know, it's not unusual, especially in the last 2 years during COVID, for people to be reflecting on their, you know, personal lives and where their career fits in. But I think we're losing a part of that. And what I've heard too often, not a huge amount, but too often, is LSRP saying, I just can't deal with DEP anymore. I don't want to be the one to have to fight over this stuff. I've been in this, put the number of decades you've been doing this, you know what you're doing, many of whom were part of DEP at some point, and just, you know, tired of pulling the hair out of what's left of it, you know, and that's not a positive thing either. So there are certain signs that the old command and control concepts of the department have reinvigorated to the point where professional judgment is becoming so secondary. And that's not how the program was set up.
And I think another point that you made was that, you know, those folks who are maybe opting out at the end of their careers here, you know, those are the ones who would fight for their professional judgment. And you know, we need to make sure that, you know, less experienced LSRPs who are coming up in the program understand that, you know, they do have the ability to exercise professional judgment. And as Phil said earlier, they need to defend it.
And just two things on that, and then we'll, I guess, move to our next topic. I know Ted put an interesting comment about you know, how do you, you know, bridge the gap between the 20-year-olds and the 60-year-olds, and, you know, based upon, you know, what their strengths and, you know, weaknesses and how they force themselves. I think, Steve, you touched upon that. Will we have newer LSRPs pushing as hard as aged LSRPs or senior LSRPs? But also, too, I think, you know, one quick point is, and you guys touched upon it, just to make it clear, there is no more time where it's important to document everything you do and every agreement you get from the department and everything than now. And just, you guys want to touch upon that a little bit? I mean,
I feel we should actually be moving on.
well, we are.
We got a lot to cover.
I think, write as if you're writing to someone who has no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think we should cover that in the next topic, by the way.
Okay, well, we're gonna. George is keeping us on time now. I'm really,
Yeah, that's unusual. So, Andy, if
only
you don't
because he
mind,
kept
I
quiet
want
for
to
10
jump in,
minutes.
because this is
George,
the albatross.
remedial
This is
action,
the albatross.
remedial action permit process. Go.
This is, in my opinion, the biggest erosion of professional judgment that was conceived and approved in Scherer. And it gets back to a lot of what's being said. Let me give you an example. I walked in to a meeting on a technical consult, and I said, this is my professional judgment. And by the way, I need a remedial action permit before I can go to an RAO. That's what it says. So they can, if they keep the remedial action permit hostage, theoretically, you don't get to an RAO. So my concern was, I don't agree with your professional opinion, DEP, and you don't have standing. I have standing in terms of my professional opinion. And if in fact you don't agree with it, and I were able to go to an RAO, which I cannot do if you don't approve my RAM, then I would have an opportunity to have a complaint against you. So my point simply is, who is going to take a case against DEP for interfering with the professional judgment of an LSRP? Who's willing to take that stand? Because I don't know where this is going to go unless we have understanding at the top that this program is broken. And the reason it is broken is that the reviewers in the RAP program have no fundamental understanding of the LSRP program. And not only that, it's willy-nilly, it's inconsistent. And guess what? DEP has all kinds of guidance for us. Shouldn't they have guidance for their reviewers? Shouldn't they have training for their reviewers? Shouldn't they have education, including external opinion and instruction as to what the LSRP program is about and where the problems lie and the type of responses that we get from DEP? And just when you think that things are going to get better, they get worse. And the perfect example to that simply is that the assistant commissioner promised that he would review the remedial action permit program in order to make it better. After 2 years, the report came out and the recommendations came out and did absolutely nothing to streamline the program and dealt with, I want to say, Andy said it deals with the low-hanging fruit. It deals with the fruit that's on the ground. It deals with historic fill. It deals with no engineering controls. It deals with all the stuff that's low-hanging fruit, and nothing has been done to substantively change the problems with having these reviewers be picayune and inconsistent. So I feel very strongly about the fact that there needs to be leadership at the top of the program to say, look, we don't, first of all, I want to admit that not every LSRP is not gaming the system. I get that. But on the other hand, the majority are not necessarily gaming the system. And my opinion is when they say there's 90% deficiency rate, that speaks legions to the fact that the program is broken and somebody's to blame, and it's not just us. So I feel very strongly that something needs to be done, and I will continue to be a proponent for that and advocate for that, even though I'm no longer a member of the board, which actually it's Berkowitz Unchained. Go, Andy.
So let me back up a little bit and fill in some of what George was talking about. There have been a number of efforts to try to fix what I think is almost universally recognized as a broken program. The renewal after permit process takes too long. You know, in transactional work, when you start talking about the timeframes just to get those, people glaze over and it's fine, I'll build in North Carolina. I mean, I don't want to have to deal with New Jersey doing that, which happens. And yes, there is a responsibility for the department to issue a permit. That said, the efforts to streamline have really not been effective. There are 2 steps forward and then there are other steps back. The department has come down with some concepts for their new rulemaking, where they're going to put in general permits. That was what George was alluding to. And those general permits are the lowest of the low-hanging fruit. Can it help? Yes. Interestingly, they didn't commit to the time frame for those or a separate process necessarily, although administratively you would think that would happen. The biggest complaint happens all the time, the department keeps harping on, and I'll use the word harping because I think it's unfair, that the applications that come in are inappropriate or incomplete or administratively deficient. And the reality is that some are, but many are because the forms and the applications just don't fit the model. They're way too detailed, they're way too nitpicky, they're way too cross-referenced in ways that just doesn't help. And some of the this box wasn't checked, that box wasn't checked. The checklists that have come out have been helpful, but not necessarily there. The more complicated you make an application process, the more likely that you're going to have an administrative deficiency somewhere along the line. And moving forward with an application and saying, yes, fix these things as I review it technically, should be something that can be done when it's minor. Oh, your check was made out not to Treasurer, State of New Jersey, it was made out to State of New Jersey Treasurer. Okay, I'll replace the check. And trust me, I'm going to replace the check because keep looking at it technically, because why are we delaying? Because the check wasn't there. And there are things like that that happen all the time. And it's just so administratively red tape focused that the general permits hopefully will make it easier. But if the forms are complex and you can't have this, you can't have this, you can't have this, and you narrow it to the point, then you're creating a general permit that rarely fits the circumstances. And there should be permits by rule, which George has pointed out in the sessions. And DEP is listening, but they're not necessarily getting there. And those are just for soil. For the groundwater, it tends to be more complex. But again, trust that the professional judgment of the LSRP had a basis for it. Okay, come in and say, help me understand this. And that doesn't happen as often. And then the backlogs get more backlogged, and then the piles get higher, and no one has time to actually make the phone calls or follow up, and then you can't reach people. It's just a disaster of bureaucratic red tape.
I just want to Yeah, I just want to jump in here for a second. I mean, I
Wait
really
a
want-
second, Steve. And let me just say, I think there's some other things to be said, quite frankly, and I'd hate to squander my time and give it to you, by the way. So at any rate,
We got,
I
George, we
do.
got time for you. We got time.
We must be
Yeah.
looking at the
We
wrong.
got time.
agenda.
Go ahead,
Go
Steve.
ahead.
Go ahead.
No,
Go,
go
Steve,
ahead.
go.
Go,
All
Steve.
right, listen, I just wanted to harp on history for a minute. Most of us, I think, were there when this statute was first written. We knew this permit program was going to be a problem. Right at the outset, those of us who were advocating on behalf of the environmental professionals and to make the program better, we knew the permit program was going to be a bottleneck. It's a strangling bottleneck. Yeah, I don't know whether we need a statutory change in order to make sure we get the kind of fix we really need. We need some fundamental change in how DEP deals with these permits. I don't know whether general permits are going to be enough. We knew at the beginning this was going to be a problem.
Right. So I think, and I'm going to jump in here, and Steve is right. Way back when, if you remember correctly, the only purpose the permit was going to serve was to keep track of engineering controls. That was Irene's concern, or only concern. And that's the only reason the permits evolved at that point in time. So it wasn't for looking for DEP's approval, but by de facto, when it became DEP's permit, they had the right to look behind everything. And that's the problem. When you take a look at the history that goes into developing a point you get to the point that you're ready to issue a permit, and all the information, all the data is not screened by the permit reviewer. They don't have the time to do it. And therefore, they'd have a very myopic point of view about what's going on at that site. I will tell you right now, it needs a change at the top. A commitment at the top. I gave Mark six suggestions how I would structure the permit program. And yes, somebody mentioned you need external input into that process. Absolutely. If you put together a group of people who really were committed to making this process work, you could do it. But without that commitment, it ain't going to happen. And it does require external input.
I was just going to say, and we talk about the fact that the RAP program is the second bite at the apple, but it's the apple that never is finished, because we're now seeing on the biennial certification submissions, and historically we'd submit the biennial cert, you never heard anything. We're now getting responses back on them. So, the part about the remedial action permit program, it never ends when it comes to DEP review. It's on till the future. And anytime they're now coming back with questions and comments about things you did 30 years ago. So I think that's one of the big, Steve, I want you to say it, because you said it the other day about this program and what I thought was the best sentence. I'm giving you credit for this sentence.
Wow. Well, you can say it because I don't remember what I said.
It was Andy said it. Andy said it.
Andy said it?
Yeah.
Okay. DEP is grinding down an LSRP's independent professional judgment. And I thought that summarized the remedial action program.
And that is, I think, a factor of some people leaving giving up their LSRP license. I mean, enough is enough. This is becoming inefficient and costly and ineffective.
And again, not with a focus on what's protective of human health and the environment.
Exactly. Yep.
Correct.
Exactly. And that's our ultimate responsibility. Okay, we beat that up for a little bit, though we could go on. That could be, as George always said, a 3-hour program, which included 20 minutes of him clearing his throat. So now we have, we put some time in here for A901. We did a hot topic a few months back with Tracy Straka and Michelle Zalizzi, which was great. And then there was a SHRAG meeting in October, which I still think has clouded this entire goal or objective, whatever that might be of the department, for the A901 as it comes with LSRP interaction. So we talked about it for a half hour this morning. I think we settled out nothing. The question really comes out is, when do you need to have an A901 license? And when is the LSRP or professional exempt from an A901 license requirement? Are really the things that are extremely unclear when it comes to consultants and professionals. forget the fact of PRCRs. Because I remember George Nicholas on the call from, I think he's PSE&G these days, or New Jersey Natural Gas, I'm sorry. He asked the question, does he need to have an A901 if they're moving material from one facility to another? And the answer that came back was yes.
Can I jump in, Phil? I know I'm not part of your panel, but just a real quick request.
I was hoping you'd say that.
Okay. A group of us, spearheaded by Tony Russo, have a very in-depth conference call scheduled on the 19th with Senator Smith to ask for a legislative fix for all this, because we are getting nowhere quickly with the department. So what he has asked is for us to compile all these different kinds of scenarios and questions. So I don't know if you want to be the keeper of them and have them filtered to you and send to me, but if anybody has specific issues that they would like me to relay to him, he has promised it can't be done obviously during lame duck, but that he is going to introduce legislation to fix this program.
So if I jump in, and it may be some of the history of help, I think it's an excellent idea. Phil, I think you could put that together.
Well, I was gonna say, Andy, if Tracy, if you don't mind, not that I'm pushing off responsibility, if you want to put your email in the chat and have them just send it directly to you as opposed to me being the middleman.
Okay. I'm fine with
So
that.
If you're
this
okay with that.
derives from a series of issues generally grouped together as called dirty dirt, where you had an isolated but significant number of situations where people put contaminated or otherwise solid waste dirt where they shouldn't put it. Totally off the grid instances. None of these involved documented remediation cases. None of these involved actually projects that were, subject to permits. These were, black market, if you want to call it, movement of material from place to place to place. So in reaction to that, we're in those communities, certainly a significant issue and a frustrating for the solid waste group at DEP to try to address, and they had years to try to fix it and still hadn't. The legislature, and I'll put the blame on Senator Smith, although he's not here to defend him, pulled something off the shelf and say, why don't we use the A901 program? And whether it was here, the department did that. And the A901 program was put in and was named after an assembly bill years ago to try to require solid waste industry to document that they're not being controlled by organized crime. That was the image of Tony Soprano running the solid waste industry in New Jersey. And it involves detailed background checks of everyone who has an ownership interest in any truck driver, and you have to go through that process. And so to address a problem that wasn't dealing with the compliant community, they created this, fitting this issue into a completely inappropriate program for it. It's like saying, in order for me to have access to my local supermarket, I have to get a top security clearance from the CIA. It's just inappropriate, and it creates the market opportunities for the people who don't want to comply and makes it hard and confusing for the people who do want to comply. For site remediation cases, everything's supposed to be documented. What comes on, what comes off the site, it's being documented, and it's not ending up in someone's backyard. And then the exceptions that were put in, and the department has to grapple with these very severe definitions in the legislation, and the department has not shown a willingness to sit up and say, you know what, notwithstanding the definitions in the statute, we're using our administrative discretion to say this isn't required for these instances and create broad cutouts. And they haven't done that, and they haven't done it well. And some of it's from the regulatory process and the bureaucratic approach, and some of it's just from a fundamental misunderstanding as to how soil is moved from site to site in state New Jersey, whether it's a development site or remediation site or other construction sites. DOT technically should be involved in this, but they're exempted out of that. And that's a huge amount of soil movement in the state of New Jersey. So the whole process was just poorly conceptualized, poorly designed, thrown into the wrong framework, and it needs to be gutted from that and pulled back out.
Well, let me jump in. Just, we're prognosticating about 2022 here and what might happen. I'm going to ask, my co-panelists a couple of questions. I'll try to answer them first. I hope I don't turn out to be wrong. I'm probably not the most knowledgeable person on this program or issue, but we're going to be scratching our heads about this program for sure. Are there safe harbors? If you're an LSRP acting as an LSRP on a contaminated site and you're managing, dirty dirt, do you have to have an A901 license? I think the answer is no. And, is it possible there's some permutation that runs afoul of some little aspect of the guidance that's been confusingly issued? Possibly. But, if you're an LSRP doing what LSRPs are supposed to do and you're dealing with dirty dirt, you probably ought to be feeling pretty comfortable, even if you don't have an A901 license. So go ahead.
I was just going to say, comfortable is an interesting word because I don't think any LSRPs feel comfortable in anything right now. But but the issue though is because there's such a gray area, and like as an LSRP, 95% of the time, my client handles all soil disposal. Okay. And I get the documentation. I make sure the facility is providing, is doing what they need to do. They're going to an approved facility, but that's really my involvement. So it's really not me. I'm not directly involved. So that's a gray area.
The other question I guess I was going to throw out is this one. In light of the, let's say, lack of clarity, do we think that, DEP or the Attorney General's office would be taking enforcement action in 2022 on this issue until it's clarified? I hope not. I would think not.
I mean, again, you're talking 2022. I would hope the answer is not. Okay. We did not have a change of governor. We don't think we're going to have a change of commissioner. We are going to see some other changes when it comes to site remediation program. And that's, what this is under now, so who knows? I mean, not to take a shot at attorneys, and I apologize for it. I mean, sometimes there's a case to be taken and it's taken, whether it has value or not. So, it depends on who they want to make an example of is always what it comes down to. And I think, and, I know we're going to move on, but, they put out some Q&A from the last SHRAG meeting in October, on the issue of due diligence that has no clarity. I'm still trying to figure out what they mean by LSRPs conducting all appropriate inquiries are considered a retained LSRP and are exempt from A901 requirements. I mean, the definition of retained is hired. Isn't everybody hired to do due diligence? So there's no clarity in what they're putting forth. So I would hope you're right, Steve, that nobody's going to take action.
It's so messed up. I agree with you, Steve. I hope they don't, but it's such a hot button item, and optically to show that they're doing something about it, I would think that, it wouldn't be unusual for, a usually very professional Attorney General's office and the department to try to say, we're going to make an example of this person just to go down that path. I hope that there's a recognition that it's attempting to put a square peg into a round hole, and it needs to be reworked.
Can I make an observation that's germane? I think my concern is the background of people at the top of the organization and whether they're captive of the technical staff below them without being able to really question them thoroughly as well as appropriately. It used to be that the commissioner was a policy guy. He was a kind of figurehead, dealt with the political stuff, but beneath him was a strong technical person as a form of a deputy commissioner who was able to screen the issues and deal with the issues most appropriately based on the reality of the issue as well as the implication of the issues. I see that lacking in this department. I see that significantly lacking. And therefore what happens is that the third tier people are running the show. And because the upper tier has not the ability to question them from a technical as well as from a policy point of view based on precedent.
It varies, obviously.
I'm sorry?
It varies within the department. I mean, there are people who are very well versed in their programs in upper positions, and there are people who aren't. You know,
I'm talking from the deputy on up.
but you know, the mantra has always been staff runs the department doesn't run the staff.
Andy, that is a failure.
Been a while.
We're gonna move on. But please send any comments, questions, issues to Tracy and myself. I'll make sure Tracy gets them for the call on the 19th. That's great. Hopefully there will be movement because it is not in a good place right now. So now I'm going to roll my sleeves up because Steve's already attacking me yesterday. And we're going to talk about the Site Remediation Professional Licensing Board, LSRP's responsibilities, and we're going to talk about the complaint process and the outcomes. And we're going to start with the external perspective from Steve.
I'm going to the restroom, Steve.
Well, okay, yeah, and they wrote external perspective in this agenda. Phil, not to take you to task or anything. I'm not sure what it meant, but I have represented a lot of LSRPs, and Andy has too. In the disciplinary process, being investigated, being disciplined, trying to negotiate, those cases, and it's certainly a challenging process. We have Phil here. He's very involved in the process. We have George. He's been involved in the past, and so I want to get some prognostication, so to speak, from them. I was looking at the disciplinary decisions and the outcomes on the board, and it's about, if you sort of look at the number of cases, it's about kind of 50-50 in terms of what they decide was no violation, the board that is, and when they find violations. I haven't seen any, sort of change, if you will, or trend in terms of, are there more complaints? Are the complaints being decided particular ways? It seems to me that, that hasn't changed all that much, maybe with some caveats. There's a lot of decisions related to some very low-hanging fruit. Did an LSRP provide the notification that a time frame would be missed? And, if not, that's a violation of the rules, and, there's discipline and a small penalty. I mean, there's almost a dozen cases, maybe it's not quite that many, where somewhere between, a $250 and $1,000 penalty was issued for failure to provide that notification. I don't know what to make about that. I mean, it seems to me there might be better ways to try to give the LSRP community about the need to do that than, kind of spend time on these very small issues and cases and $250 penalties. But, I don't know, I was trying to look at trends in terms of the cases, and it was tough for me to pull them out as, let's say, an external stakeholder. So I'll ask Phil and George to address that in a minute. I mean, it is a challenging process. If you've been investigated, if you had a complaint filed against you, I think we're getting used to this program. I was involved in the very first case in 2011, and we're 10 years later. And I think that sort of the heat, if you will, maybe has come down a little bit, just in terms of, I deal with the LSRPs and how they perceive these investigations, these complaints, and the discipline. And it's a very difficult, time for somebody to be investigated and to have that discipline issued. We were joking before about, I don't know, this comment I made to Phil the other day. He's going to talk a little bit about the board determination. I happen to have one over here, board determination and offer of settlement. BDOS is the acronym, and
BDOS.
BDOS.
BDOS, woohoo. Well, I suggested it should be shortened from BDOS to just BS. And,
Can you mute Phil? Can you mute him?
please. That's the process we have now. The board has taken advantage of it. It's a lot less formal. As a lawyer, I sort of don't like it from a due process standpoint, from notice to the LSRP of the conduct that's being complained of. There's a lot of things that I don't like about that process. This is why I made the funny comment that we should shorten the acronym to BS, but it is where we are. I've been involved in a lot of cases that took a long time to resolve, and I'm not sure that that process really helps all that much in that context. I probably have the case that took the longest to resolve. I'm not sure. I had one that took about 5 years. And I was trying to think about, and I haven't talked to Phil or George about this, what can we do about this? Can we make it better? Because I don't think it's that good, at least for the complicated cases. And, so I'll throw out the idea that maybe we can try to come up with, or you, I'm the external stakeholder, come up with a better way to deal with complicated cases, maybe through a mediated process, use of a third-party neutral, or George is shaking his head, no, okay, shocking. But there's got to be a better way, in my opinion. So I may advocate for that, guys. I certainly want to get your input on it and see if there's any traction there for 2022.
Yeah. So I'm jumping in because it's my turn. Yeah, again, and I'm going to give you my personal opinions. Again, right now I'm not speaking on behalf of the board, but being on the board, it is somewhat one and the same because I am the chair of the PCC. And I will actually agree with you, Steve. I think some of the time we spent on mandatory time frame, what I call them tickets, you can take a point for that, maybe, too much. But really, I think what it came down to was that really comes out of the audit process. And when the audits are being done, that's where they really look at that and they see, did the LSRP satisfy their conduct and submissions? That's what Sarah says. And so that's one of the things that comes out of it. It's not action's not taking in 100% of them. It depends on the severity and where the person is. And, there is some, leniency put there at times. But I do agree. But I think the other thing too is in 2022, and I'm going to placate a little forward, that we are starting to see, more complaints coming from PRCRs than from the department. And I think that's what people thought would happen in the program as it went forward. And, it does take a long time. There's a couple difficulties that we have, and one we can't fix, that we're short members of the board. And you can only stretch people so thin. Right now with George leaving, that's put the board down another LSRP. If Joanne Held ever leaves the board, I don't know what will ever happen, but she's almost involved in every complaint process because it's Dr. Strom, Joanne, or Jeff Hoffman. They're the only non-LSRPs on the board right now.
Right.
And we make sure that there's a even playing field when we evaluate these things. And I will say, and again, not speaking on behalf of the board, we talk a lot about money, about fines and penalties, but we talk about the fact that the most important thing is the LSRP's reputation. You could be fined, $500, $200, $1, but the minute your name is on that website, that's what we need to be concerned about as the board and as LSRPs in general, because we don't want to be there. So we do spend a lot of time talking about these complaints and making sure that we come up with outcomes that are representative of what we want to have as a profession in New Jersey. So we do spend a lot of time on that. The BDOS, quite frankly, and we talked about this in public, it expedited you spent 5 years on one, okay? But it expedited the process because we don't use our attorneys. It's a preliminary finding.
I will jump in on this point. It's not that unlike the situation where the department reaches out to a permittee and says, we've seen a violation and, maybe we just come up with a quick settlement on how to resolve that.
Exactly.
violation. It's not that different than that in terms of process, but certainly I think it could be improved.
Right. But what I was gonna say is for 2022, I think you are going to see less complaints. Because I think that you're starting to see these timeframes and the documents going in. And I think you're going to see that the department may be doing less because they're concentrating on getting things out the door. And the board is going to catch up. You know, we're going to 2 times a month now that we're meeting the PCC, because my goal is to make sure that we can get these done quicker for the LSRP's benefit. They don't want this hanging out there. It gives many people ulcers. So I think you're going to see them be done quicker. And I think you're going to see less in 2022 if I had to guess as to where we are as a profession. But again, I think, you know what, 2009, 2011, you know, George's flow sheets and, you know, flow charts and everything we came up with, we had nothing to work with other than looking at Massachusetts. And we did look at Massachusetts a lot, and George will say that. And, you know, but you know what? New Jersey's not Massachusetts, and things are definitely different down here. You know, George, you want to say something?
Yeah, and I'll segue into my audit process if that's okay, Phil.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to reiterate what you just said. We started with a blank slate. We were taking enforcement action without any rules in place. I am very proud of what the board has accomplished in 11 years, 12 years. Very proud. And I think we've come up with a process now that has reached almost a state of equilibrium. We made changes along the way to try to make it more efficient. But quite frankly, when I take a look at the audit process, and I want to be very clear, the audit committee does not make the decision whether to file a complaint or not. An audit committee only does an audit and refers, if there's an issue, to the PCC. And the PCC will determine whether or not a complaint is valid or not, or appropriate. We have changed the audit process. We streamlined the audit process. We were almost up to date, whereas previously we had an incredible backlog. We made the audit committee in total the audit review team, so there was consistency across the board. And I think that that has served the process very well. I would like to believe that, quite frankly, the whole process here, as Phil has stated, is to create a profession that's imbued with trust. And that's why we have the audit process, and that's why we have the professional conduct committee. And again, I think we have come close to reaching a steady state. We have new rules coming on board. And the question is, are they significantly different? My opinion is no, they're not. So I believe this equilibrium will kind of remain intact. And Steve, yeah, you're right. A lot of these complaints take a lot of time. You know why? Lawyers give us a lot of, the lawyers defending the complainant give us a lot of material to review and try to, we weigh carefully every decision, carefully, and we take time to do it right. And
Well,
if that's the price,
George.
I'm sorry?
That's good to hear, George. And I just want to ask you, because you mentioned the rules, can you lay out a schedule for the rules?
Not me. I'm not a member of the board anymore.
Okay.
So let's just continue a second along this process. I do believe that from the beginning, we had more complaints from the department that we found not appropriate. We rejected a majority of the complaints from the department. We are not prosecuting the LSRP. We're trying to preserve the integrity of the program, irrespective of the components and the elements. And that's what's important about this. That's why I got involved. That's the only reason I got involved, was to create a profession. And I think we have created a profession. Does it need to be tweaked? Does it mean the profession's perfect? Does it mean that ethics is a standard that everybody follows? No, that's why we have professional conduct committees. That's why we have audit committees, to make sure that the public is ensured that the program is working the way it's supposed to work. And to that end, I think we've accomplished a lot, whether it's the audit process, and I think I'm very proud of how we've created the audit process. And Phil was the first chairman of the audit process. I was the first chairman of the professional conduct process. Phil, have they appointed a replacement for me on the audit committee?
Me.
No.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah. Ira's the chairman, but I'm a member now.
Oh, okay, but I was the chairperson.
Ira's the
Good.
chairman, yeah.
I was good. So at any rate, without going any further, I do believe we've reached if in fact you look from an objective point of view of how the audit process works, how the PCC process works, is it perfect? No, it's not perfect, but boy, it's damn good. And it's something we should be proud of.
So, Steve, to answer your question real quick, so the board rules sunset in January of 2023. There is a proposal that has been put together. I know that there's been some of it revealed at the board meetings. Waiting for direction from the commissioner's office right now. There seems to be a logjam up there. I know anybody, I see Ray Papperman's on the call too. I mean, environmental justice has been hanging out there for a while. So I don't know where we end up in the whole mix of things. But we're going to sunset January 2023. We got to get a proposal out. We got to do public hearings. Joanne is by hook or by crook saying that's going to happen this year. So I know she's pushing real hard. So I would say stay tuned. It should be relatively soon.
Yeah, Joanne deserves special mention. Like Phil says, without her, we should just fold up our tent.
So I think we beat that up pretty good. Steve, did I at least address some of your questions without avoiding the others?
You did a great job, Phil.
We'll see. So we are at 9 o'clock. We had said we're going to go a little bit over. One of the things that I thought was important to talk about, and maybe I don't know if there's necessarily resolution. If you have questions, you can start putting them in the chat. But this whole issue of discharge notification of an LSRP performing due diligence has been a hot topic. Many believe it was not solved by SARA 2.0. And the board did put together a subcommittee, which I chaired. And, you can say we punted it back to the department. I think that's a fair statement because of the definition of remediation. And we don't feel that the board should define remediation. We feel the department should, and we feel that needs to be addressed. And the department, they're working on rules too. So we're not quite sure what they're going to come out with. Yeah. But I can pull up and we can talk about the specifics. If you guys think we need to read the definition of remediation, hopefully everybody knows it. But I wanted to throw it out to you guys especially to Steve and Andy. How do you advise LSRPs who are doing due diligence and your clients who need to do due diligence? Because I think the LSRP industry wants to hear that.
Well, I'll jump in. I think a number of the stakeholders, I won't name names, and stakeholders, I include the agencies and the board in that, have made a bloody mess of this.
Are you English?
Am I English? I suppose it's my first language, but yeah. By way of Belleville, New Jersey. So I don't know. I just, I'm speechless on the whole thing. I think people have gotten it wrong. And I think, so I'm disappointed that the board punted, because I think that it's the board's responsibility to say what LSRP obligations are. And the board has the ability to interpret its rules and interpret the statute just like any agency. And I think really in resolving this issue about whether or not LSRP should have a discharge reporting obligation during due diligence, it's not just about what is the definition of remediation. In fact, that might be the least important part of it.
No. But that's the door opener though, Steve. I'm sorry for jumping in here, but to me, you're absolutely right. I agree with you 100%, but there was disagreement amongst the board. And I'm not so sure we would reach the consensus. My point simply is that they've taken the Attorney General's office, through the form of a DAG, has interpreted remediation in a very broadest context. So to me, it's analogy to talk about the term football. The term football in America, in the United States, has a different meaning than the term football in England. And what they're saying now is football is universal. It doesn't matter whether it's in England or in the United States. It means that remediation is remediation, and therefore it's not taken out of context. I think we need to put it in context. Remediation under what term and under what conditions? Otherwise, they're going to say due diligence is part of remediation because it involves a PA. And PA is part of the remediation process. That needs to be fixed.
Right. That's the concern, that this very, very literal definition of what remediation is and all appropriate inquiry sort of takes out of context the question of, is a person doing due diligence doing remediation?
Yeah, agreed.
No,
Agreed.
they're not.
So, I mean, this harkens back, I'll do a little brief recap. I remember being in committee room 1 when we were discussing various parts of the legislation. There was a fire drill. We all had to step out. We came back from the fire drill, and there was the issue put on the table of, do you want to preclude LSRPs from being involved in due diligence? Because these are going to be amongst, not only, but amongst the most qualified professionals handling remediation sites. And you would expect that a purchaser would want to use pull from that group of people. And there was a debate on it. There was the LSRPs can never take their hat off kind of concept out there. And there was a medium ground met that wasn't perfectly clear. When we got to SARA 2.0, which I like to call 1.1 because it wasn't a huge change, the department pushed to preclude anyone from doing due diligence if they weren't an LSRP, and that they would have to report anything they found. They didn't get that. They got some changes to the definition of remediation, but not as significant as many of us think the department interprets it as.
Yes.
So it's still left ambiguous. We know from a broader perspective that if someone who's not an LSRP is actually orienting a remediation and designing the remediation and then implementing the remediation, who's not an LSRP, that's not something we want. We also know that if it's just a preliminary assessment, there's no way it meets the definition of remediation, because even though preliminary assessments can be included in remediation, remediation only applies to sites where there is known, threatened, or
Suspected
remediation, and it ignores the concept that many times the preliminary assessment is done to confirm that there isn't contamination. Yes, there was a loading dock. I'm doing an assessment. I decide that a sample might be. Now I shift to the SI, the site investigation phase. I don't think it leaked. It looks integrity, but you know what? I took a sample to make sure. That's not known, suspected, or threatened in my mind, unless it's like, hey, we saw a massive staining here and it's not there. And that's a nuance. Department is in no way interested in the nuance. I know Mark is the chief advocate for it. I don't want to put all the burden on him, but he's got wide shoulders. He can handle it. Mark is the advocate that LSRPs cannot be involved in due diligence. That's really what it comes down to. And it is not a nuanced or nor helpful perspective. And I'll give an example that I think from my perspective adds the best example of nuance. Someone's acquiring a site, it's an agricultural site. It's in the area of central Jersey where there are glauconitic soils where arsenic occurs naturally. There were also pesticides applied to the site from time to time. And someone's trying to get an idea as to whether or not there's pesticide impacted soils at the site or it's naturally occurring arsenic. Sometimes it's really nice and clear. Sometimes it isn't. Often it isn't. They have to do background sampling. That's not PA, that's SI. Is it suspected? No, I'm trying to figure out whether or not it was there. I know that there could be arsenic, and I took some samples. I found arsenic. It doesn't seem to be from arsenic, lead arsenic. The ratios are off. It doesn't seem to be. The glauconitic soils are present. You can see the crystal of the blue-green in it. I have a line of evidence saying it's not, but I need to do some background work. I need to do additional work. That is extensive work. I would love to know that the most qualified consultants are involved in it. And amongst those are the LSRPs. It doesn't mean it's known, suspected, or threatened at that point, because it looks like it isn't. I want to know one way or the other. And I have to go through multiple lines of evidence to come to that conclusion for some sites. And who is best qualified to document that multiple line of evidence to say it's not from pesticide contamination? LSRP. But the way the department is presenting, an LSRP can't be involved in that process. And that's absurd. And yes, it can be a fine point, but the department has shown no recognition of the need for nuance in there and just said, we're taking LSRPs out of the situation. So to answer Phil's question earlier, my advice, unfortunately, to my clients are, the department's position is LSRPs can't be involved in due diligence.
And I will tell you, I think the flip side, and again, Mark's not here, but it's always easy to talk about somebody who's not, it's an empty chair. And I don't know for a fact, but I believe it's the other way though. I believe that he believes LSRP should report everything they know. So they should be doing due diligence.
Yeah.
I think he wants to know before anybody if a site's contaminated or not.
Right. But the fallacy of that is, I'm a seller. I don't want that to happen. I'm rather not anyone buy my property than do that, or I'm not going to allow that to happen. And the reality is, and I'm not saying I have the most extensive experience. I think it's fairly say that I have extensive experience in brownfields in the state of New Jersey, having been doing this for the period of time I've been doing it. Whether or not the first buyer is the one who buys the property, or the second or the third, eventually the site gets flipped. And as Ken Clue had it stated during the initial SARA stakeholder sessions, and I don't think it's changed, a high percentage, it's somewhere in the 90s, of all remediation sites that enter the department new are because of brownfields. Sites get cleaned up because they get redeveloped.
Right.
And you're creating an obstacle from the market perspective of forcing disclosure prematurely.
Yeah.
For an issue that, whether it's a year or 2 or 3 years later, gets resolved. And the big issues that impact neighborhoods, you don't need the data from a single site. Once I know there's groundwater contamination in a region, which is the bigger issue that impacts properties and people's lives around the state, especially in urban areas, I don't need to be on the site to have that groundwater sample. And the department has a wealth of data of where hotspots are and regional or sub-regional groundwater issues are throughout the site based on all the data that's been developed. We want to encourage people to explore sites. We don't want to discourage that. And by requiring that LSRPs disclose everything, you're taking LSRPs out because we'll just not use LSRP.
And I just want to go back to something Steve said. I think as much as I agree that the board punted on the definition of remediation, I think the board did come out and reinforce the fact that LSRPs who have knowledge of unreported discharges have an obligation to report it. You know, when they're, I mean, again, if they're retained, so they're hired and they're doing remediation. So again, that goes back to the fact, what is remediation?
Yeah.
No. And, you know, again, it's, and I will agree with Andy too. I think, you know, 99% of the time when you do a preliminary assessment, okay, you're just basically pushing papers around a desk.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that really remediation? Well, it's in the definition, and that's what someone will fall back on. But the minute you start digging around, I don't necessarily agree with you, Andy. I think if you're digging around by a loading dock, you suspect there's something there. I know you take the opposite because you're a more positive person than I am. You
Here's
know,
the problem, and Andy said this, but the interpretations by DEP and the board are contrary to the objectives they want to see. Because the way they're interpreting this, LSRPs are just going to be excluded from due diligence, you know, in 90+% of the cases. And it's not serving the objectives of facilitating the cleanup and redevelopment of brownfields. I think we all support.
And the other thing, in terms of prognostication, I'd be very careful that if this thing landed on Senator Smith's desk, that he would repeat the underground storage tank requirements. And that is, any person with knowledge has an obligation of reporting. And he said that to me once before. So I think we have to be very careful as to making sure that the different perspectives get revealed. I agree with what's been said by Steve and Andy both. I think that this is a chilling effect on brownfields, could have a chilling effect on brownfields.
But again, I think, you know, and I'll say, and I know Steve and Andy were both there. I mean, in the SARA 1.1, as Andy wants to call it, Senator Smith did throw that out there as I guess the nuclear effect they call it, and that was not taken. So I think that's where that is now. And whether Senator Smith revisits it, we'll see.
That's right.
And I'll give an analogy which is potentially apt, and that is, it used to be on college campuses that if someone were drunk, everyone, you had to report it, you had to go through that, because why do we want people being, underage drinking on campus? And over the years, most campuses, if not all at this point, have an amnesty policy because they recognize that protection of people in a health risk situation is more important than enforcing the rule against them, right? I mean, that was a public health perspective. Is it morally perfect? No, you're allowing illegal activity to occur, but you're also recognizing the bigger goal of making sure that the people who are in those situations aren't afraid to go to the hospital or their friends take them to get help. Okay. Mm-hmm. That's the type of societal discussion we could have on this, but we don't. We have this minute, focused, semantic, worst case scenario discussion, right, and we don't elevate it to the next level.
Hey Phil, can I make a recommendation? I'm sure there's tons of questions that want to be asked at this point in time, and it's probably a time to do that. What do you think?
We're going to start taking some of the questions. I thought that was good, and so I have a couple on here. I'm going to shoot them out to you guys. And Maureen says, on the remedial action permit process, we're going to go back a little. What is a proposed solution?
There is none. I mean, the proposed solution, quite frankly, is simply get serious about fixing the problem. And that has not resonated at the most important place within the department. I'm not convinced that they think that they haven't fixed the problem. And after 2 years, they have not fixed the problem. So I think the proposed solution is to keep harping on this, and demonstrating that what is happening in the bowels of the organization is counterproductive to cleaning up brownfields, as well as contrary to the professional judgment.
I guess I'll add, I think a general permit program could solve some of the problems if it's implemented, without too many straitjacketing conditions and rules.
I don't disagree with that, Andy, Steve, and I think that is part of the solution. But when they start constraining the general permits as vigorously as they constrain it, I don't see the willingness to open up.
So Roxanne asked, is the commissioner aware of the erosion of the LSRP program?
Doubtful.
I will tell you, I've met him a couple times recently at the end of 2021. We did talk about the program, but as far as he knows, it's one of the most successful programs. It's going very well, and everybody is happy-go-lucky.
And that gets to my point that the commissioner's captive of the people running the programs, and without having the ability to really investigate it and understand what's really going on.
I think part of the recognition of fixing the problem is the department needs to recognize that they're a big piece of it, and I don't think they've recognized that.
Yeah.
And the commissioner, he's a lawyer, obviously a very smart guy. Maybe it just hasn't been brought to his attention, in the right way. DEP also has other priorities, PACT, climate change, many things they're looking at, that they haven't looked at in the past. So
environmental justice, yes.
Environmental justice. Thank you. So
it's not like the commissioner has a lot of free time. So it's not unexpected to think that he would rely on his senior staff in the Site Remediation Solid Waste Program to really just do what they need to do.
But on the other hand, Andy, if this is one of his premier programs and hallmark programs, he needs to have an ability to be approached. And I don't know that he has that ability to be approached from the external community. Right,
but on a global function, and I agree that it's broken. It's not broken. The permits eventually get issued. The resolution eventually happens. It just happens in a ridiculously long time frame.
Real quick, is there any movement that you guys know of on environmental justice rules coming out, and or the proposal for ARCs and tech regs and all that stuff?
They're supposed to be being drafted on ARCs and tech regs. I have no idea on time frame. Whatever DEP says, just add an extra 50% or whatever to it. as it goes through. But they're definitely working on it because Mark thinks when I've heard Mark speak, he thinks it's important that they incorporate a lot of the changes from SARA 2.0.
Flipping the top. I'm sorry, go Steve.
I was just going to say, you look across programs and you look at the, rule proceedings, stakeholder meetings, rule proposal. It's pretty challenging these days to predict when DEP is going to come out with a rule. They're going to adopt it.
I know a number of groups have commented to the commissioner's office that the process of stakeholder processes has fallen apart.
Flipping the page a little, what can we expect in 2022 regarding emerging contaminants, PFAS, ...
Well, go ahead, George.
No, there is an interesting book on how emerging contaminants become emerging contaminants. If you think that PFAS and 1,4-dioxane are the end, you got to read this book. And it goes into the political, social implications as how emerging contaminants will happen. And don't forget, we're regulating PFAS to parts per trillion. Where's this going to stop? So I think, quite frankly, that emerging contaminants will continue to be a problem. I think that if one can make a compelling argument that in certain cases, PFAS is an anthropogenic contaminant, not necessarily associated with any activity that occurred at the site, and therefore should be treated as such, like almost like natural background or anthropogenic sources. Not so with the manufacturers.
I saw a couple of questions about PFAS. I mean, I have seen Najipti's permittees asked to, monitor for PFAS. I think an interesting question, and I haven't seen it in my cases, so I don't know if any of the other folks on here have. I haven't really seen in my cases yet DEP looking at PFAS evaluations and taking action with respect to them, whether it's disagreeing, saying you need to do something. I haven't seen that in my cases yet. Maybe that's something that we'll see in 2022 as more of those get submitted and the agency starts to look at them.
What could be a sea change is the individual potable well testing program. If in fact PFAS is looked for and found in individual residential wells, it creates
that just started, George. I think it was in December that the Private Well Testing Act required PFAS to be analyzed.
Right.
So we're going to start to see it in that way.
Right.
And part of this does seem to be a huge information gathering exercise on behalf of DEP to understand where the potential sources are, where it's found. If you've represented clients that have discharges to POTWs, significant industrial users, or those who had to respond to DEP questionnaires about potential sources of PFAS, really seems like we're kind of at the beginning of the information gathering stage, and there's more to come, and some of that will be 2022.
Yeah. The question here from Ken, and there are some comments going. I'm not bringing the comments out, but the questions, submitted for extension requests for the May 2022 mandatory timeframe back in November. When will I anticipate a response from the department? I will tell you, I start my morning every day by going to those PI numbers and looking to see if they've been approved yet. They have not. I have, my regulatory time changes have been updated. So I see that on my reports. What is it? May 7th. So if you go back 60 days, that's March 7th. So, that's when they have to be submitted by. I personally, I find it hard to believe that the department can deny any of them.
Well, I'll say I have had one approved. It was sitting there for a while. I know that there was kind of a backlog of activity and maybe more recently, if you will, they started looking at those that were submitted, 6 months ahead of the deadline. So I think we will see approvals of those extensions, and that they'll start to come.
But theoretically, correct me if I'm wrong, any delay caused by the department is an open invitation for an extension and mandatory required that be extended.
Right, but if you're submitting an extension for mandatory time frame, then how do you get a DEP, DEP holding you up for the extension. I mean, you need to know if you're getting the extension or not. I mean, otherwise you're going to direct oversight. So it'll be an interesting thing that ends up happening. But as a reminder out to all the LSRPs, we talked about it a little bit before, if in your professional judgment, a PRCR is not going to make a mandatory timeframe, you have to submit that form and let the department know that they're not going to make the timeframe. There is no deadline on that form. If their deadline is May 6th, you can submit it May 5th.
And Phil, this brings up the point, there's two forms that have to be submitted. The notification that they're not going to make the mandatory timeframe and the request for the extension.
They're two different forms. That's correct.
Two different forms.
And Ted puts here, maybe it's time for the consulting coalition to come back together. And there's been a lot of theme there. Maybe there's a reason, and I'll shoot out there. And I know that the LSRPA meets with the department a lot. I know that other stakeholder groups meet with the department a lot. I think the department needs to hear from all of us that there are issues, but as I know Andy's shaking his head, but it may be because it's falling on deaf ears.
But you got to recognize that and I'm not necessarily saying that this is the thinking, but it's certainly consistent with the concept that the more ambiguity each remediating party has as to whether or not they're going to trip a deadline, the more likely that the department will consider that they're under pressure to complete the remediation. So it's to the department's tactical advantage to create ambiguity because that pushes people to take extra effort in their mind. All right. So I do believe there's a conscious element to, we'll give the extensions when we need to give the extensions, but we shouldn't be foreshadowing that too much because people could do better. And in some cases it is true. So I don't expect deaf ears, but I expect ears that don't want to go down that path.
Well, I just want to add, Andy, consultants that I'm working with on many of my projects are all telling me in the last few months it's impossible to get a driller because everybody is doing things, either to set themselves up for their extension or to try to complete work before May. Let's do an injection program and submit an extension request, and so there's something to that idea that if we don't let up on the gas, there will continue to be more investigation and remediation.
Right, and over the past 3 weeks, if not a little longer, you're having a hard time getting drillers and contractors because everybody's sick.
Yeah,
and it is. I mean, we've had 2 jobs canceled last week because the driller was sick, and it pushed everything back. And now it's just, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Hey guys, you want to get together and buy a drill rig? What do you think?
You first.
Can we call it PB&J A and F drill rig?
Yeah, good shot there.
Yeah.
Anything closing, guys? I think we're at 9:26. We wanted to close this out. So I think this went very well. I think we covered some good topics. Hopefully people did get something out of it and it wasn't a waste of their time.
First of all, I want to thank my good friends, not only professional friends, but personal friends, Andy, Steve, and Phil, quite frankly. It's been a pleasure working with you guys. And Steve, I'm sorry for cutting you off, but you won because I didn't cut you off. So I apologize. Thank you very much for participating. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. And so we do this regularly. We do something every month. Next month, we are actually going to have Tony Russo, who's going to give an update on the 2022 environmental legislative agenda of what he thinks. And I did just put into the chat as a cheap and advertisement. Next Thursday, the 20th, George and I are doing the board rules. If you're not clear on the board rules and are interested in learning more, we have the rules course. I put the link up there. Thanks again, Steve, Andy, George. I thought it went very well.
Great. Thank you, audience. Thank you for their participation.
Yep. Thank you, everybody. Be safe. Stay well, everybody. Stay well.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.